So let me just step back a little bit and think about the system as a whole. It feels almost like a domino system of power in which the master at the top is exercising control over the mistress, who then exercises power, control over the slaves, who then fight back with whatever tools they have available to them. I mean, we know, I don't think we'd call it power, but we know that some enslaved people had more authority, you might say. The cook in the kitchen had more authority than the kitchen helper, for example. So what you're really talking about is a household system that's built on power relationships.
It is, and what I'm also talking about is that this hierarchical system, that the mistress is not so far below the master.
Right.
And in some instances, she's beside him. Because there are women who have no husbands or fathers in the home who are mistresses of their own plantations, right? And women who do have husbands, but who do exercise within the space of the plantation sufficient authority that slaves cannot discern a difference between the power of the master and the mistress. On the other hand, your point is well taken when we look at the overall picture, that it's him, her, the slaves, and then when you look at the slaves, they're broken down. You know, a slave who was runs a gang for the overseer or for the master has certainly more power than other men on the plantation. His wife tends to have more, if not power, she has more in the way of maybe a better cabin. Maybe she works 2 days of the week.
Better resources.
Right. And all of these things are designed to make the system work better, and that's the important thing to keep in mind, as opposed to thinking that if a slave has in this instance, has greater power, isn't that nice? Well, it's nice, but it's a way for the slaveholder to keep everything, right, working.
So if you think about the plantation house as a workspace, which has these hierarchical relationships, what about that old saw of domesticity? We've talked a lot about domesticity, and women have always worked. You're saying that Southern women may have had a veneer of domesticity, but violence to their slaves doesn't sound like piety, purity, and submissiveness to me.
The plantation household was a peculiar space in which women were, on the one hand, taught to flower in the way of the notions of domesticity, and they heard these ideals about domesticity from the pulpit, from their fathers, from their mothers. They learned them from prescriptive literature, from mothers who trained them. And so on the one hand, you're taught to be a lady, and on the other hand, you're taught to be a manager of slaves. And if you're not taught, you're placed in a position when you marry that that's what you do, but it's not alien because you've seen your mother do it.
But in practice then, even though the ideology remains that of the lady, in practice, Southern plantation mistresses couldn't be.
They couldn't. You're right. They could not be domestic idols or
Right.
that's because you see them struggling, right? Struggling to come to terms with the fact that they are cruel or have been in instances cruel. And they pray, they turn to God and for help, and solving this dilemma. You know, how could I have beat her so?
Talk to us about the actual violence. Are you saying that mistresses actually took whips and beat their people who worked around them on a daily basis?
Not all mistresses beat, and not all beat their slaves daily. But controlling the people who worked for you in your home required that you resort to discipline, disciplinary measures, and the most familiar such measure was the whip. And you know, slaves in their narratives talk about mistresses who whipped for no reason at all. For a woman, and this is one example that I use in my book, for a woman to be sitting at her dinner table and her slaves are serving her, for her to become so provoked by the service that she would take the eye out of the slave serving her at the dinner table.
What? Take the eye
yeah,
out of...
she plucked the eye out. For a mistress to be so provoked that she would resort to actually engaging in fisticuffs with the woman she owned, because this woman refused to take a beating. And so here you have a mistress and a slave woman on the floor fighting, and slaves are observing this, other enslaved people. It's a huge problem, and one that was for a long time kind of ignored by historians or pushed to the side. And there were many people who said, yeah, there was violence in the plantation household, but to try to understand the nature, the extent, and its lasting legacies is a quite different matter. A great deal of violence and a great deal of repentance on the part of women who just knew that they had to do it, but also knew that it was ungodly.